All right, let's talk about it. The whole debate over transgender people and public bathrooms. It's one of the most emotionally charged topics out there. But what we're going to do is peel back the layers of the story we're so often told, first by looking at a little history, and then by seeing what the actual data says. Because the reality of who's truly in danger here, well, it might really surprise you.
But before we can even get to the bathroom debate, we have to ask a much bigger question that the whole thing rests on. Is the idea of just two genders, male and female, really some kind of timeless, universal truth? The historical record is pretty clear, not even close. In fact, this super strict gender binary is a surprisingly recent idea. Now, this is where it gets really fascinating. For thousands of years, cultures and major religions all over the world recognize gender beyond a simple male-female split. I mean, look at this. Classical Jewish law identifies these 6 different sexes. Hinduism celebrates the bi-gender god Ardhanashwara and has long recognized hijras as a third gender. And classical Islam had concepts like the Muqannath. So this isn't some new idea. It's actually an ancient understanding that we've kind of forgotten.
So how did we get from that ancient understanding to where we are today? Let's get into how this modern panic was actually built. Because the intense focus on bathrooms, well, that was no accident. It was a very specific, very carefully crafted story designed to make people afraid.
And this is the argument we hear constantly, right? That these non-discrimination laws aren't really about protecting people. They're some kind of loophole for predators, putting the most vulnerable people at risk in what should be a safe private space. And this quote just brilliantly nails the problem. As the journalist Jane Fay puts it, this story has become a persistent urban myth. It gets told so often and gets repeated by the media without any fact-checking that it starts to feel like a real everyday threat, even when there's zero evidence to back it up. So here's the crucial thing to understand. This isn't some organic fear that just bubbled up out of nowhere. Experts actually have a name for it. They call it a trans panic. And it's a deliberate strategy to stir up moral outrage by falsely painting transgender people as a threat to cisgender people. That is, people whose gender identity matches the sex they were assigned at birth. Okay, so what happens when you tune out all that panic and you just look at the facts? What does the evidence actually show in all the cities and states that have had these exact same protections for years, sometimes even for decades? Well, the verdict is just overwhelming. Law enforcement officials in at least 12 different states have all said the same thing. In Hawaii, no increase in sexual assault. Maine, since 2005, they're not aware of any increase in incidents. And get this, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, they've had these protections since 1997, with no reported spike in problems. The fear, it turns out, is a complete ghost. This statement right here is one of the most powerful you'll see. It's from Jane Doe Incorporated, a group that advocates for victims of sexual assault. And they don't just say the argument is wrong. They call it beyond specious. And then they completely flip the script and tell us who the only people truly at risk in this situation are. And that's transgender people themselves. And that statement, it brings us right to the absolute heart of this whole thing. If the data is clear that trans people aren't the predators, then what is the reality of the violence they're actually facing every single day? Who are the real victims here? A huge study from the Williams Institute at UCLA gives us the staggering answer. Transgender people are over 4 times more likely than cisgender people to be the victims of a violent crime. Not the perpetrators, the victims. And this chart just makes that reality impossible to ignore. Look at the difference. For every 1,000 trans people, you have over 86 violent victimizations. For cisgender people, that number is less than 22. The danger is absolutely real, but it's flowing in the exact opposite direction of the myth we've been sold. And if you think that's bad, when we zoom in on sexual assault specifically, the numbers are just horrifying. Data from the U.S. transgender surveys shows that 47%, that's nearly 1 out of every 2 transgender people, is sexually assaulted at some point in their lifetime. Just let that sink in for a second. Almost half. So, if trans people are being victimized at these insane rates, who's doing it? Well, a 2008 study broke it down based on what trans survivors reported. The perpetrators were overwhelmingly cisgender individuals. 81% were cisgender men, and another 16% were cisgender women. I mean, the data could not be clearer about where the real danger is actually coming from. Look, this epidemic of violence doesn't just happen in a vacuum, right? It's the direct, predictable result of a culture of dehumanization that starts with myths like the one about bathrooms. but it definitely does not end there.
Now, this next point is heavy, but it is so important that we hear what the experts are saying. The Lemkin Institute for Genocide Prevention, they actually warn that the ideology behind these anti-trans initiatives, the one that paints trans women as illicit, dangerous, and criminal, shares a really common theme with genocidal ideologies throughout history. It's the classic playbook of painting a minority group as a threat to society's purity.
And that ideology fuels a vicious, real-world cycle. It starts with stigma, which leads to families and communities pushing people away. That rejection then creates massive barriers to things like housing, healthcare, and jobs. I mean, in India, for example, only 6% of trans people have a formal job. All of this leads to extreme poverty and isolation, which then dramatically increases the risk of violence and devastating mental health crises. It makes simply existing in public a dangerous act. You know, history has taught us this lesson over and over and over again. The moment we as a society decide that a certain group of people isn't worthy of sharing public space with the rest of us, that their very presence is a threat, that is the moment we start walking down a very, very dark path towards stripping away their most basic human rights. And really, that's what this all boils down to. As Justice Radhakrishnan of India's Supreme Court put it so powerfully, this isn't really a social debate or a medical one. At its core, this is a human rights issue. It's about the fundamental right of people to simply exist, to be seen as fully human, and to live with basic safety and dignity.